So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for firstly having me and also coming along to my talk, which is really cool. So this talk is about initial access and pretty much just about initial access. I'll talk about that in a second. But who am I? So I'm Tony G. I'm a bit of a ex-Blue Team, as you can read all there. My passion really lies in open source intelligence and social engineering, both physical and remote. Although I do kind of want to be a purple teamer because I really do like purple teaming. I think it's pretty cool. But I guess coming from that Blue Team background, it kind of lends itself quite well. But anyway, you can reach out to me there if you want. But let's crack on and talk about this talk. So I'm sure you know what that is. That's the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And what I want to really explain is that what I'm going to talk about is the stuff in red, pretty much. Everything up to execution, not including all execution. And the reason for that is this talk is about initial access. It's not about what you do after that. So hopefully we're on the same page and hopefully we're all happy with that. So let's start off with our reconnaissance. So ahead of any job, of course, we need to do some open source intelligence. And so for us, I think when we're trying to gain access to an organization, the key things, obviously, are email configuration. So we need to find out things like SPF, DMARC, and DKIM, find out what that looks like and whether there's any weaknesses there is really important. We need to find out what their mail security gateway is. You know, are they using a particular type of product that we might be able to bypass or that we've got bypasses for? Text records. I cannot underline how important text records are for us as attackers. And the reason they're important is because quite often they will include supplier information. And that supplier information we can use in our pretexts. If they're using Office 365, do they have a smart host available? That can be extremely useful. And if you know about that, you'll know why that's useful. If they've got Teams or they've got Slack, that's really cool because you can direct message staff. Bypass all of the controls and just contact them directly. Obviously, any services that their staff use, so things like VPNs and Citrix, those are really useful. There's a couple of seats over here, guys, but you will have to sort of slide past people. I'll give you a minute to get in. There's 4 seats at the front there if you want. I won't bite, honestly. We good? Right, we got everyone in. Happy days. So, you know, obviously things like, as I say, Teams and Slack is really useful, but finding out what things staff access, those are going to be the things that you're going to try and manipulate or try and clone, right? It's obvious. Obviously, contact details as well, if you're lucky, and especially if you're doing sort of a social engineering engagement as opposed to a pure red team style assessment, the chances are you can ask the client for contact info. And I really recommend doing that, especially if you're going to start using smishing style attacks, because the last thing you want to do is start smishing someone on their personal mobile or even on a mobile that's not theirs anymore. So it's really useful if you can get contact info from the client. So in this talk, I said I'm talking about initial access. I'm primarily talking about the social aspects of initial access. Obviously, a really simple path into an organization is through a vulnerability in some of the services that they've got installed, so their VPNs or their Citrix servers. But it really does have to be those services explicitly. Because the reality is that if you exploit some random web server on their network, the chances are in most mature organizations, that's going to be in a DMZ. So you're not really going to then be able to move anywhere. You're going to have to perform quite a lot of lateral movement to get out of that and get onto the network where staff actually work. So for me, I think, you know, realistically exploits against services, unless it's targeting some of those systems, I wouldn't even bother. Nowadays, most attacks need to be socially motivated to have any kind of success. So realistically, phishing is where we see most of our red teams start, and also our DFIR investigations almost always start with a phishing email. That is realistically the way that you get into organizations these days. If you're lucky, you might find exploits like that, but be very unlikely in my opinion, unless you got a particularly immature organization. And then have a field day. Happy days. So, as I say, phishing is probably the easiest way in. This type of attack, basic phishing attacks like these, probably less likely to work now. They're pretty dead. Corporate security controls are pretty good these days, especially in mature organizations. So, and end user awareness as well. Let's not forget that, because end user awareness is also increasing. And people are getting wise to phishing emails and phishing messages. But they do still work. You just have to work harder. And you have to do a lot more research, and you have to use your OSINTs to guide you on the best pretext and the best technique for that delivery. So as I mentioned, key things for me, TXT records, find out who their suppliers are. If you can find out whether they use something like KnowBefore, it gives you great pleasure to use the KnowBefore phishing header and bypass their phishing security controls, which is brilliant. Works really well, and I strongly recommend doing it. I add it to every one of my phishing emails just on the off chance that they use KnowBefore. It really works quite effectively. And I'll just sail past all of their spam controls and end up in their mailbox, which is quite cool. Job sites are also really quite useful. They can tell you the technology that's in use, so you can find out what you can fake or consider faking. Email trails as well. So you can create a fake email trail. If you can find a full email trail, you can, with the signatures and the email footers, you can use that to create an email trail, which will add legitimacy to your phishing email. I think nowadays it's really important to use trusted domains for your links. I think these days you can't just stand up a website and send in a link and expect that link to work. Most proxy servers will block that straight away, or at least they'll put a reputational risk on it, and then end users will become more aware that there's something not quite right there. So for me, you've got to use trusted sites. GitHub's quite useful. Using sort of other sites that are more trusted that you've got a lot of experience in is very useful. But what I really like using is I like using domain fronting. So, domain fronting is not just for your C2. You can use it for your phishing links as well. And what's really cool about domain fronting is you can use something like Azure Edge or CloudFront. They're probably my favors. I actually really like Azure Edge. And the reason I do is because Microsoft really don't care about it. If you've got a Microsoft organization that you're targeting, and that's where your OSINT will tell you that, you can't realistically nowadays just go and buy a domain that's kind of like Microsoft. You can't buy M1 Microsoft or whatever. It just doesn't work. But if you use Azure Edge, you can create a subdomain that looks exactly like their brands. You can literally squat on their brands. I had numerous domains on Azure Edge that were, OneDrive or OneDrive download or whatever. Just usual sort of stuff that you would expect that Microsoft would use. I really do recommend using it. It works quite well. It's quite effective, I have to say. And it just gets straight through. And because it's a trusted domain, most proxies will just allow staff to just click on it and away you go. Happy days. And you can really get creative with it. You think how a lot of people use Azure Edge is quite often they'll use it for hosting content. So you can mimic that. So you can have really long URLs that kind of look like something that is more genuine. It's pretty cool. If you are going to deliver things, payloads, for example, realistically, your payloads do need to be fairly custom now. They do need to be built to bypass whatever defenses you've managed to identify in OSINT. Attachments, I think these days are dead. You've got to be quite lucky to get an attachment into an organization these days. You might do in less mature organizations, but most mature organizations, you're not getting attachments in. Not your common or garden ones, put it that way. I think it's worthwhile testing your spam. So testing your messages. So use spam testers to find out what reputation it's got. The other thing to do is if you can get a copy of your phishing email back from the client, review the headers. Find out what their mail proxy has done to it and find out whether or not it's been blocked. Obviously, you can't do that on a red team, but on something like an agreed social engineering exercise, there's a lot more flexibility to do that. So do that, and it'll allow you to potentially get past their controls. Fundamentally, I don't think that is cheating. Because realistically, you could email an organization and then they would reply back to you and give you headers of their emails. So, you can do that quite happily. I'd also recommend checking your domain categorization. So if you are going to use something that's not fronted, do check your domain categorization because that'll tell you whether their proxies are going to block it. Techniques I find work really, really well, though, is spoofing does still work, believe it or not, especially if their DNS configuration is terrible, which a lot of organizations, they don't get it. They really don't get the most basic stuff, like something like an SPF record is so crucial to get that right. DMARC is so important. But many organizations just don't get that. They install something like DMARC, but they put a policy of none. So it has no point. It's ineffective. The SPF records, more often than not, there'll be either a very wide SPF record. Sometimes it fails. Countless times I've found SPF records which have got too many DNS lookups, so they're not going to work properly. Or they've got a soft fail on them rather than a hard fail. So, sort that basic out and you fix a load of problems on your mail gateway. Anyway, moving onwards. But where you can't often spoof email of their domain, very, very rarely do you find supplier domains are in their anti-spoofing lists. So just typo squat a supplier. Just do that. Or even just spoof email from the supplier. It will work more often than not. Depending on the supplier and depending on what their email configuration is, of course. The other thing I like doing is I like using Outlook.com and an AWS email. So I actually prefer Outlook.com because most organizations these days tend to use Office 365, so it kind of looks a bit more genuine. And it's really easy to set up emails on Outlook.com. You don't need to give any information other than a phone number to verify it, so use a burner number for that. And it looks more trustworthy. You can also typo squat on their brands, although they didn't let me register OneDrive.outlook.com. I did try, but you can register Teams or something like that. It works quite well, but OneDrive didn't, which was annoying. But yeah, I really like it, and it's a really, really neat way of kind of adding legitimacy. Because, of course, being an Outlook.com address, most mail service will quite happily support that. The other thing that you can do is, of course, you can use the Office 365 smart hosts. I'm not going to tell you how to do it, but I do recommend having a look at those because it's quite useful because you can send emails using it and it will invariably bypass whatever third-party security control they've got in place and end up in the end user's mailbox. And it will also include things like presence indicators if they happen to have Teams. So if you send it spoofed from an individual, it will look like it's come and land in that mailbox as if it's from that individual. They'll double click the name and it will show the individual. It's very worthwhile doing. So you can literally send raw SMTP directly to it. It's very cool. So right, we can send some emails, but what exactly do we send? Well, I said pretty much attachments are heavily scrutinized now. They're not realistically going to work. But HTML smuggling is a really good way of being able to bypass that problem. So send a link to a file hosted on a trusted site, an HTML file hosted on a trusted site. For those that don't know what HTML smuggling is, effectively you create an HTML page and embedded within that is your malicious file, whatever it happens to be. It's encoded. Essentially, when they load that page, you can then decode it and it effectively downloads to the workstation and away they go. The only caveat I would say is things like mark of the web do still apply there. So we'll talk about that in a second, but there's some things you need to think about with that. But certainly, if you can host this on a trusted site, then that's even better. So if you host your malicious HTML on a trusted site, you're going to have a lot of luck with that, I would suggest. You can send the HTML as an attachment. I just wouldn't bother. Just host it. It's easier. Stick it behind a fronted web server, and you're going to be in a much better position. You can have your heart's content what kind of domain you want to use. You can make it look more legitimate, more trustworthy. It's really worth it. I really do recommend it. So, although this talk's not about execution, obviously we need to think about what we actually deliver. And Word, Excel, executables, they're pretty well detected. They are challenging, especially executables. Mark of the Web, as I said, does a really, really good job of stopping those files from working. So Smart Screen will kick in, which is a little bit annoying. But of course, you can just zip it or you can ISO it, and that does still work. It's becoming more detected now, but it does still work. So zip up your file, and then when they execute that file or they pull that out of that zip file, it won't have the mark of the web attached to it, which is really, really useful. The other thing you can use is image files. They work quite well as well. OneNote is something we're seeing as well, which is really, really cool. We've actually used that ourselves, but we're seeing that in our investigations quite a lot. So OneNote effectively opens up an HTA, which then calls living off the land binaries. So much more genuine, looks really, really real, and much less likely to be detected by Smart Screen or Defender. Realistically, macros don't really work now. Most organizations have got a handle on it. End users have got a handle on them as well. But you can use other applications. So many organizations will block things like Word and Excel because natively they support auto-exec. But PPT, you can do macros in that. So no one really thinks about blocking that. You do need to, if you want to make it kind of auto-exec-y, you do need to use a custom UI, but that's trivial to do. You don't need to provide that to the end user. It's all built into the file. So I would recommend Office RibbonX Editor for that. It's pretty cool for that. And then you just need to get creative with your lure. So you kind of make it look like it's come from a supplier, perhaps. So I actually did that one. That was a real one. Someone might recognize that particular slide template. I found it on their website. The client I was looking at actually used that company, and so I just faked it. I used that and created a load of stuff on it to make it look like it needed macros enabled. Usual stuff. Interestingly, Publisher and RTF files do support auto-exec, so you could use those. Publisher probably less so. Many organizations don't deploy that to staff, but RTF could work. It's worth a try. The other thing you can do, of course, is you can use OAuth apps. They're pretty cool for getting yourself a foothold within a Microsoft environment, so they can allow you to then do things like internal phishing or just get access to data. Drive-by compromise is something many people still talk about. But let's be honest, if you're a researcher and you've got a vulnerability in something like Chrome, are you really going to use that on a red team? No. You're going to sell it to someone like Zerodium for $500,000 and then have a very nice holiday. There's no point. So I really wouldn't worry about that or wouldn't consider that as a viable attack technique unless your target is either very well funded and your red team is a very big red team and you want to use that, or realistically you're a nation state operator, because no one's going to be using that. Why would you burn it? Same with a PDF exploit. Why would you burn that on something like a red team when you can sell it for a lot more money? Bit obvious, really. But what is really, really powerful, I think, these days is credential theft. Especially now, more organizations are using Microsoft 365 because, of course, that gives access to basically everything, right? So I would suggest that email delivered through, a trusted gateway, something like that, can get into an inbox. Once it's in their inbox, have a trusted link to a server which is hosting something like Evil Jinx, so you can then start capturing their full session information. Got 5 minutes left. Shit the bed. I'm going to be way over. There's no way I've got 5 minutes left. Wow, well, good luck. Whoever's speaking afterwards, we might be in lunch. Sorry, in the break. Anyway, yeah, I've got way too many slides. I'm like halfway through. Good luck. So the other thing is, obviously, once we've got creds, we can get access to things like VPNs. We can do internal phishing, capture other things as well, which is pretty cool. The other thing is smishing. I think these days most staff are actually quite switched on to smishing. Really interestingly, they're fairly switched on to it. I don't find it works that well now, but I don't know whether that's just me. Maybe I'm rubbish at it. But if you are going to use it, things like typo squat domains, Evil Jinx works really well in that type of attack. The other thing is lookalike domains do work quite well if you set up your own Microsoft 365 service. So set up a fake one that looks like theirs and then use that to send direct messages, so Teams messages. You can also send links through OneDrive. Most of the time, though, they will open in the web. So what you need to do is change it to download from embed and then it will just download it. It's really cool. But again, mark of the web will apply there. So you need to do something around that. Oops, gone too far. Way too far. Look, you can see how many slides I've got left to go. Loads. You'll be fine. So I mentioned Teams is quite cool for phishing. So you can send direct messages to people. You can also use Slack for this, similar sort of situation. It used to be that it was open and you could message anybody with any Outlook.com or any Teams account. You can just message them directly. By default now, Microsoft have this turned off, but most organizations that you're going to be targeting will have already had this turned on. So you can easily find it, start sending staff direct messages. It's pretty cool. Staff are not expecting it. So it's interesting. They just won't detect it. But just be aware that things like or anything you send through it will be scanned and will be checked by Microsoft. So, don't try and send through any brand new exploits that you're worried about getting detected. The other cool thing is you can phone people with Teams, so you could use it for a phishing attack. And that actually leads quite nicely onto another area of initial access that everyone forgets about. Physical. Physical is very much a viable attack technique. So, you could break in, and it's sometimes easier than you'd imagine. There's a giant gap there. Just walk through that gap barrier. You can do things like tailgating using a long man attack. Really easy to do. So you can see my colleague just uses a bag there to fool the barrier. Pretty easy. Sometimes it's even easier than that, though, which does sometimes happen. But the cool thing is once you've physically broken in, what you can then do is you can then install things like Dropboxes and then you can do whatever you want with that and have a trusted hacker-friendly platform inside. Another option is to try some deepfakes. A client of ours recently had this. One of their staff got deepfaked, and what ended up happening is they made a load of payments. Staff do not expect it at all. You can use ChatGPT. I'm sure a lot of us have managed to break out of that. That's quite fun. You can use that for writing phishing emails once you've managed to break out of it. And finally, password attacks, such as spraying, does kind of work, but realistically, on a modern organization, something like breach creds are just not going to be effective. I wouldn't worry about it. You keep giving me that. I'm not stopping at 1 minute. I'm going to finish my presentation. I'm sorry. But a less mature organization, it might work. Something like if an organization is an E5 organization, then they'll have Microsoft Identity Protection. That won't work at all. I wouldn't even step near it. So you could kind of find out in their scoping whether or not they've got E3 or E5. If they've got E3, then you might be on for a winner, but it's unlikely to be successful. I kind of like combining lots of different things. So combine different attacks together can often lead to a much more successful attack. But I haven't got time to talk through that. So what I'll do is I'll talk about how we fix all this, because it's not actually that challenging. It's actually quite easy to fix it. We're already well on the way. Social engineering is primarily fixed by awareness, by staff awareness. But then there's also technical controls we can implement. Things I would recommend you doing in your organizations if you're in a blue team. Do things like an attack surface assessment, and don't just stop at an attack surface management tool. All they really do is port scans and vulnerability scans. I would recommend looking far more deeper than that, because realistically, the sort of things that people are going to exploit through a social engineering attack are not going to be found on an attack surface management tool. Do some threat modeling, understand who your attackers are, and of course do your own OSINT. And there's a blog link there, or a link there to a load of blogs I've written. But technically, some cool things that you can do: fix your DNS, fix your SPF, DMARC, and DKIM. As I said, I cannot recommend that. It's so important to do that. Cannot recommend that enough. You can do things like monitoring for brand infringement as well. So when people register a new domain using your brand, then start taking that down straight away. You can, and I really do recommend setting up Microsoft 365 transport rules. That will help prevent that smart host problem. And use the team's allow list. And then finally, Defender, I cannot recommend it enough. It works so well. I'm sure most of you who work in the red teams know that when you encounter Defender for Enterprise, you're going to be in for a bit of a tricky day. Identity protection and password protection are also really valuable tools to use. Make sure you've got authenticated push, so using number matching, for example. Conditional access policies are also very important, but no one understands them. You can often exploit vulnerabilities that in the way people have configured their conditional access policies, especially in Defender for Cloud Apps. I found an organization who used that. They hadn't set up their conditional access policy correctly, meaning that I was actually able to register a computer in their Microsoft 365 and bypass Defender for Cloud Apps. It was pretty cool. And then, finally consider doing purple teaming. There's a really good workshop later on. I really do recommend purple teaming. It's a really, really good way of understanding what problems you've got. And this is a terrible, terrible pun that my colleague came up with. But use a defensive onion to make the bad guys cry. I'm sorry. So in summary, see, I wasn't that much longer. I was like 2 minutes later, see? So in summary, I think realistically, the balance of power these days is actually moving towards the blue team rather than the red team, which is a good thing, I think. But for us, on the offensive side, we do need to up our social engineering skills. Realistically, that is the only way you are going to get into an organization these days. And so you need to throw away those old phishing emails. You can't just send in a phishing email and expect to get a shell back. You've got to work hard. You've got to abuse misconfigurations, and you've got to use your social engineering skills. Now, I don't have time for questions, unfortunately, but if you do want to find me afterwards, reach out and we can have a catch up. Now, I think there's someone speaking right after me, so I'm going to get off stage and let them do that. But thank you.